As far as adaptations go, this one is middling at best.
You are my solution.
I put the knot in astronaut. I've never done anything. I've never done a spacewalk. I can't even moonwalk.
Oh my god, I'm gonna hang myself by the janimals if you don't stop talking.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to be reviewing the new science fiction film Project Hail Mary, based on the book of the same name by Andy Weir. This first portion of the review is going to have minimal spoilers. I will explain the premise in a bit more detail because I've read the book and want to be able to compare the two, and I think that the decorum of what is or is not an acceptable amount of spoilers to talk about early is different if the film in question is based on a book that has already been out and available for readers to know about for however many years by the time the film adaptation gets released to the masses. After the minimal spoiler section, we will proceed into more of the spoilers. I don't know if we would call them medium spoilers or full spoilers, but in order to better communicate my points about this film and my overall feedback of how this was adapted, I need to be able to talk about the source material and some of the things that were changed in the adaptation process. If I have to be reductive and simply decide whether I like the film or I don't, and those are my only two options, I would say that I don't. The film has some merits, but the primary point of feedback that sits atop everything else is that I fundamentally disagree with the approach of this adaptation. For further context, I would not say that I loved the book, but I did like it. I read it through my local library, and it's not the sort of book that I feel all that inclined to reach for in order to do a reread, outside of the reread that I did in order to prepare to see this film at an early press screening and put together a review for my channel. But the book's author, Andy Weir, originally worked as an engineer before his books proved popular enough for him to be able to switch over to being a full-time author. Because he has this extensive background in science, there is an immense level of detail in the science for this story's world building, as well as what the main characters of the story are doing in order to try to save their respective worlds. But let's rewind a bit and introduce the premise of the story. In the book, scientist Ryland Grace wakes up with a mild form of amnesia that almost immediately begins to wear off. The story alternates between him being on a spaceship working on the task at hand, and flashing back to the memories he gradually regains that explain what has happened to require him to be far out in space trying to save the world, and how he specifically ended up being on this mission. While he is far out in space, he also meets an alien whom he names Rocky, who has come to this particular place for the exact same reason as Grace. Rocky's planet is having the same problem as Earth, so the two team up to try to solve this problem together so that they may both save their home planets. A major part of what makes the book appealing is being able to read about science and the scientific process. People who have this specialized expertise in something and doing that with precision, going through the details of various scientific facts. It's the type of book that scratches a certain type of itch in one's brain. The stakes of the story are life and death. If these two do not succeed, their planets will die. Even if Grace is successful, science is science, and as such, there will be a lot of harm back on Earth. More specifically, the issue at hand is something called astrophage. It's a type of space algae, a parasitic life form that is gradually consuming the sun's energy, and thus it's lowering the temperature of the planet. Even if you're in a more informal conversation between Grace and Rocky, where they're just explaining things about the biochemical properties of each other's planets, what technology or lack thereof each of them have, there's a consistent sense of needing to solve this apocalyptic problem. But now we can talk about the film, broadly, since we are still in the minimal spoiler section of this review. This film adaptation mostly eliminates the book's reverence for the precise details of life-saving science in favor of cloying humor that incessantly undermines the dramatic tension and stakes. Ryland Grace now bumbles around like a clumsy clown. I will explain more of what I mean by that when I get to the medium spoiler section of this review, but before then, I will also share some of my positive feedback on certain technical merits of the film. The sets and production design, everything that involves building the world in a real physical way, those people who did that labor deserve to be praised. There are those who might say that this film feels like a throwback to bigger films from way back when, but I honestly reckon that a fair bit of that is simply coming from the fact that you didn't overly rely on rushed, underfunded VFX work that results in a visual aesthetic of gray sludge, as has become commonplace in expensive blockbusters of this particular decade or the last decade and a half of filmmaking from Hollywood. The film's score was also good and would have been far more effective if it weren't for the aforementioned cloying so-called humor of this film constantly undermining things. There are moments when you can see that the film is, for once, trying to emotionally commit to something more meaningful, and the score is doing a tremendous amount of the legwork, but it can only do so much when we are an hour and 45 minutes in, and you've been bombarding me with your attempt at jokes far too often that I've not been allowed to emotionally buy in to those serious moments. And I'm not surprised that the score is better than the film itself, because the score was done by Daniel Pemberton. How many times has he made a score that absolutely slapped? Numerous times. The Man from U.N.C.L.E., King Arthur, Legend of the Sword. Remember the heaving panting in that one? It was phenomenal. And also his work in Birds of Prey? Excellent. His scores have a lot of character in their own right. Furthermore, the craftsmanship in building Rocky and the puppeteers who are bringing him to life with specific movements, that's exactly the sort of work I would love to see showcased in more films. Now, I will admit that I had imagined Rocky as appearing more slightly metallic looking, and I would have liked to see him building things more often than he did, but him as a character, that was done well. Finally, I would say that if you are choosing between the two, I would say to read the book. You can borrow it from your local library. If you don't already have a library card, you can sign up and get one, and then you can borrow that book and read it for free, because that is the power of libraries. You read the book from your library first, and then if you discover that you really love it, you can buy a copy of your very own to add to your home library collection. But when it comes to this film, there is this persistent refusal to fully engage with the most interesting scientific world-building details of the source material, and instead focus on juvenile, grating humor that undermines the apocalyptic stakes of the story.
I am Rocky.
He's kind of growing on me. At least he's not growing in me, which was a concern for a little while.
But now I would like to talk with medium spoilers. Normally, doing a review this early, I would stay far away from most of the spoilers, but because this is based on a book that has been readily available to read for years, I'm going to present some examples of my issues with the approach to this adaptation. Like the book, we are introduced to Ryland Grace as a man out in space. He wakes up after having been in an intentionally induced coma. In the book, they eventually explain that people who are going to make this trip have to be put into a coma because with the research that's been done into all of the variables of how to make this mission successful, they have determined that the people who are going to be sent on this mission will have a mental health crisis that is extremely severe. If they have to spend all of those years it will take them to arrive at the planet that is their destination, that's where they need to visit, awake with the knowledge that this is a one-way trip and all of this pressure that they have on themselves to be successful. The fate of the world rests on them. When Grace wakes up, the only thing he can communicate with is the ship's system. Grace starts to realize as he makes his way throughout the ship and interact with things that are on the ship that something isn't quite right. The speed of objects falling feels wrong. So he proceeds to do a scientific experiment. He will drop objects and time how long it takes for them to fall with a stopwatch and does some calculations which reveal to him that the gravity in the room is too high. And this is how he realizes that he's not on Earth. Mind you, at this point, his amnesia is such that he has not remembered his own name yet, but the scientific knowledge, that has stayed intact. In the film, he's just stumbling around and eventually reaches a window in the ship that allows him to look outside, and that's how he realizes he's in outer space. Now, this example on its own, that's not particularly egregious. Film is a visual medium, and you might be excited to show the audience all of the labor that has gone into making space look like outer space in your film. However, if I put my skepticism aside on that first part, what happened next confirmed to me that this film was probably not going to work in the way that I would have liked for it to. In the book, once Grace is awake, he will ask the ship for food and the robot arms will give him a tube of food. The first meal he is given is brown sludge, and Grace is able to think about how if he was in a coma for a long time, he would have been fed through a tube that was running down his esophagus. And he also thinks about how his digestive system is getting used to semi-solid food, which is why the computer will not allow him to eat as much as he wants. His body has to gradually get acclimated to being up and active again. His meals gradually become more solid. In the film, he pilfers the vodka stash off of one of his dead colleagues and gets drunk. Why? so the audience can laugh at Ryan Gosling acting like a doofus. The film is full of multiple examples of things like this, of having Grace act hysterical. He'll just be screaming. He just acts ridiculous in a way that he never did in the book. And it very much comes across like they want to make the movie into as much of a comedy as they think they can get away with. They want him to act like a doofus, but he also has to know exactly as much science as is needed to move the plot along. Book Grace, even when he's not gained all of his memories back, he is a highly capable scientist. He starts to remember the astrophage problem very quickly, so he gets to work on that even though there are major dramatic reveals that come back later as certain memories begin to return to his memories the further chapters you make your way through. At no point was Book Grace smacking and pressing buttons erratically trying to figure out what to do like he's a toddler. The robot arms and the ship system together are able to offer a certain amount of clarity, particularly to someone that is a highly capable scientist who did a lot of preparation for this mission. He would not be acting hysterical, and you are making your protagonist utterly ridiculous. A ridiculous, hysterical toddler, and you want viewers to believe that he is capable of doing the careful science that is needed to save the world? That's nonsense. The film adaptation of Project Hail Mary boasts a runtime of 2 hours and 36 minutes. Now, I am not someone who opposes a longer runtime for a film. If anything, I would prefer for a longer runtime for an adaptation of a book like this because of how much more information and world building you would be able to include. The problem with the film is that it doesn't include anywhere near as much of the world building details as it could or should. In the book, they give you so much information about the scientific makeup of numerous things, of astrophage, of Rocky, the planet he comes from, and they gloss over so much of that, even though all of these things are a pillar of the story's world building in the book. These details do matter. I will give you an example of another science fiction film series that is very successful. James Cameron's Avatar. You know about the mycelia, Tsahelu, Amrita. It makes the storytelling more immersive. The audience is able to feel like they're in that world, they are on Pandora, and they understand a great deal about that world. Project Hail Mary is a book about a scientist doing science. That's what Grace's job is. Rocky, the alien he meets, is an engineer who keeps things running on his ship, makes repairs and whatnot. The reason that Rocky is the only alien alive is because his species doesn't know about radiation sickness, and there's a much longer explanation given for that has to do with the scientific properties of the planet he comes from and why that species would not know what that is. These are the types of details that get glossed over in the film time and time again. They do not explain them fully. I don't feel immersed in the world of the film the way that I was when I was reading the book. The film feels like it's made in such a way as to be corporate and tick boxes. Don't ruffle the feathers of the viewers who have been radicalized to not believe in science. That brings me to another detail of the book that was not included in the film. While you were in the flashbacks of Grace's memory of all of the preparation that was done to make this mission happen and have it hopefully be successful, one of the things that they talk about is how because the sun is dimming, because of the astrophage problem, the effects of climate change have more or less gone away because of this lowering of the temperature of the planet that's been happening as a result of astrophage. However, the entire issue of astrophage is that it's going to continue to consume the heat and energy of the sun, and the planet will continue to cool, and as such there will be catastrophic consequences. Therefore, they make the decision to launch fusion bombs at the ice caps to cause a massive greenhouse gas emission to try to fend off the effects of astrophage for longer while the mission will be underway, and the climatologist that is working on this team buries his face in his hands and cries after they do this because of how antithetical this action is to everything he has spent his career working on. And so much of how this film was made gives me the impression that this part of the story was removed so as to be more palatable to the masses. I just can't help but wonder what a film adaptation of Project Hail Mary would have looked like if it had been in the hands of a director that was truly passionate about science. I'm not saying this needed to be a James Cameron film, but he is the first name that comes to mind Because what other high-profile Hollywood director do you know who built his own experimental model of a submarine in order to go down and explore the depths of the Mariana Trench? Another thing about the science of the book is that they're so clear in describing how meticulous and precise you have to be to accomplish these tasks of the mission at hand. And that's part of the story. It's not just some extra bits of exposition dump that you don't really need to know. If you're running out of runtime, you can get away with removing that. The science is the story here. I would not be able to tell you how I would have experienced this film if I hadn't read the book first. There is really no way for me to know for sure. At most, I can speculate that I probably still would have found the incessant so-called humor to be a disruptive interruption that undermines the dramatic stakes and tension of this story. I'd love to see a great comedy or a comedic story, but this is a life and death stakes sort of story that necessitates that the people in charge, more often than not, need to maintain the emotional drama and tension of those stakes. And this film simply doesn't do that for me. Overall, I would say to read the book from your local library if the story sounds interesting to you. Mickey 17 was a much better example of how to respect the dramatic stakes of your science fiction source material, that being the Mickey 7 book, while knowing which bits of extra exposition and world building would make sense to trim so that you can accommodate the film adaptation's runtime. Without going into details, I will also say that I did not like a change that was made to the film's ending relative to how it was done in the book. With the book's ending, there was a finality and a textured realism to how things end up, but in the film, it just felt like, once again, it needed to be more light in tone and have it be overly cheerful of an outcome for the protagonist. It results in things feeling more frivolous compared to the book, for the sake of being commercially appealing. All that being said, Project Hail Mary, the film, is by no means the worst adaptation I have seen this year. All my critiques aside, if I were going to score it, I would probably put it somewhere directly in the middle of whatever scoring system I would be using, because there is a mix of positive and negative feedback. My final recommendation is that if the premise of the story interests you, read the book first. Support your local library. I am there often nowadays to research source material for various adaptations. And speaking of that, this is the next adaptation we're going to be talking about on here. I have already confirmed to attend a press screening for this.